Whether you travel north, south, east or west, the British landscape is as varied as it is lovely, and for the great authors of English literature, the countryside has always provided a rich tapestry of inspiration. From the Kent of Charles Dickens to the Hampshire of Jane Austen, there's always somewhere fascinating to visit. And with D.H. Lawrence's Nottinghamshire, George Eliot's Warwickshire, and Thomas Hardy's Wessex, there's no shortage of locations. But when it comes to wild, dramatic moors, it has to be the Brontes' Yorkshire. I'm Liam Dale, and I'd be delighted to show you around.
I promised you wild, and I think you'll agree this landscape is certainly that, and a great deal more besides. This is Haworth Moor, and if I tell you that this is where Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, along with their brother Branwell, played as children, you'll instantly recognise where the inspiration for such dark, brooding, romantic classics as Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall came from. But wonderful as these great novels might be, the story of the three sisters is equally as fascinating, and if we take the path across the moor to the town of Haworth and the parsonage at the top of the hill where the Brontes lived, you can see for yourself how this tragic and turbulent tale unfolds. By the time the girls moved to Haworth, when their father, the Reverend Patrick Bronte, was appointed the perpetual curate of St. Michael and All Angels, the family was definitely prospering. And you may be surprised to learn that there were two older sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, as well as our future authors.
Maria had just turned 6. Elizabeth was 5. Charlotte, brother Branwell and Emily had been born in consecutive years, followed by Anne, who was just a few weeks old when the Brontes arrived here in February 1820. As Mrs. Bronte was kept busy with her brood of 6 children, her husband settled into his new parish, and his parishioners would have quickly realised that their new vicar was quite a unique character. Born into poverty in Ireland, young Patrick Bronte, as the family were known, was determined to make his way in the world, despite being one of 10 children. He was a clever boy, and quickly realised that education was the best way to achieve his ambitions. Even so, being accepted at Cambridge to study at St. John's College was remarkable, and as well as taking up a promising career in the church, Patrick also had aspirations to become a published author. He was actually quite an accomplished poet, and no doubt believed that changing his surname to the grander-sounding Bronte might help him progress. When his studies were complete, Patrick served as a curate, first in Essex and then Shropshire, before moving to Yorkshire.
After a brief stay at Dewsbury, Patrick Bronte came here to Hartshead in 1811. It was an interesting time. Hartshead was at the epicentre of the Luddite protests. Many of Patrick's parishioners were part of the movement, rebelling violently against industrial progress. The threat to the mill owners in the area from workers who'd been laid off as a result of new machinery was deadly, and even the Reverend Bronte found it sensible to keep a loaded pistol to hand at all times.
In later years, the Bronte children would be fascinated by their father's tales of the Luddites, and Charlotte would actually use Patrick's reminiscences to form the plot of her novel, Shirley. As the troubles subsided and peace was restored, Patrick found himself well respected and settled in the parish, and at the age of 35 turned his thoughts to marriage. When he met the lively Cornish-born Maria Branwell, the niece of an old friend, romance soon blossomed, and the happy couple were married in 1812. The family quickly grew with the births of daughters Maria and Elizabeth, but the ambitious Patrick, after 4 years, was ready to advance his career and was appointed as perpetual curate at Thornton Church, a short distance away. The church may not have been the prettiest, nor the accommodation provided for the Bronte family the grandest, but they soon settled happily into their new parish. If you take a closer look at the house they lived in, 74 Market Street, you'll see that there were 4 new additions to the family in quick succession. Charlotte was born in 1816, Brother Branwell in 1817, Emily in 1818, and finally Anne in 1820. These were happy days. Patrick even enjoyed some local literary success with his poetry and prose, while his wife relished a delightfully busy social life amongst her friends and neighbours. But this was far from being a large house, and with 6 growing children, not to mention a couple of servants, it wasn't long before the Reverend Bronte, ambitious as ever, was looking around for a bigger parish, an increased stipend, and a more appropriate property to cater for his domestic arrangements. So when the living at Haworth, just 5 miles away, became vacant, complete with its large Georgian parsonage backing onto the moors, it was time to exchange the cosy comforts of Thornton for the wild landscape that would inspire such great literary creations.
What a pleasure it must have been for the Bronte family to arrive here, although as for us today, in January 1820, it might well have been a tad chilly. But it's immediately evident that this substantial property was built to withstand whatever the weather threw its way. Getting on for 200 years later, what is now the Bronte Parsonage Museum is as welcoming as ever for visitors from all over the world.
With so much hope for a bright future, Patrick Bronte had come a very long way from the poverty of his birth in Ireland. But within the briefest space of time, this fleeting joy would turn to sorrow and utter despair. Mrs. Bronte fell ill soon after moving into the parsonage, and it was a terrible blow for Patrick. Already weak after the birth of her 6th child in as many years, Maria was confined to bed. Despite her husband's tireless efforts researching cures and looking for medicine, nothing could combat the cancer that had taken such a speedy but secure hold. Then, when all of the children were struck down with what was then the deadly scarlet fever, Patrick's tenure at Haworth that had started with such promise seemed blighted as he faced losing his entire family.
Fortunately, Mrs. Bronte's sister, Elizabeth Branwell, came to the rescue, arriving from Cornwall to take charge of the household, and soon the children had all been restored to health. But their mother, after suffering horribly, lost her battle for life on the 15th of September, 1821.
She was heard to cry out,
"Oh God, my poor children."
And the sight of Mrs. Bronte's coffin being carried through this narrow gate to her final resting place in the family vault in the church must have been devastating to witness.
Distraught, the Reverend Bronte shut himself away from everyone in his grief, becoming stern with the children who were, by all accounts, grave and silent beyond their years. Elizabeth Branwell, a strict Methodist, considered it her duty to care for her sister's children, so she remained at the parsonage.
Gradually, order was restored, and the children turned to each other as they played together out on the moors, where they would not disturb their father. One of the family servants described the touching scene.
The 6 little creatures used to walk out hand in hand towards the glorious wild moors, which in after days they loved so passionately.
Life did go on, but sadly for the Brontes of Haworth, worse was yet to come. Education had been the making of Patrick Bronte, and when he found a school for clergymen's daughters advertised, the two older girls were quickly dispatched, with Charlotte and Emily following a few weeks later. All that remains of the school at Cowan Bridge, about 50 miles from the parsonage, is a row of cottages that made up part of the establishment. And as delightful as the setting looks today, all was far from well back in the winter of 1825. The school had been started by a well-intentioned clergyman who'd been horrified by the number of weddings he presided over where the bride could only make a mark in the register because she was unable to read or write. But sadly, the establishment was beset with difficulties, and it wasn't long before catastrophe struck.
The first the Reverend Bronte knew of the tragedy about to unfold was when news came that Maria had fallen ill. Conditions were bleak at the school, and in the cold and damp, Patrick's eldest daughter had contracted tuberculosis.
A typhus epidemic had also broken out, an episode that Charlotte would recall vividly in her novel Jane Eyre. But by the time Maria reached Haworth, it was too late. She died on the 6th of May 1825 at the age of 11 and was buried with her mother in the family vault.
Then news came that Elizabeth was also suffering from TB, and when she reached Haworth, obviously very sick indeed, Charlotte and Emily were immediately brought back to the parsonage too. And if you want to know what happens to the girls, all will be revealed in just a few moments. Thankfully, the news wasn't all bad. Charlotte and Emily, as you know, survived to tell the tale, but sadly Elizabeth, just 2 weeks after returning to Haworth, followed her sister and mother to the Bronte vault. She was 10 years old.
For the time being, Patrick Bronte kept his surviving children with him, but continued as withdrawn and stern as ever. Charlotte, Emily and Anne, along with their brother Branwell, became extremely close, and out on the moors they started to write imaginary tales.
When Patrick Bronte gave his son a box of toy soldiers, he really started something, as the children made them into the heroes of their stories, creating imaginary lands out here, far away from their father's disapproving gaze. The Reverend Bronte was already suffering from deteriorating eyesight, and the creative children wrote everything down in the tiniest of books, preventing him from seeing what they were up to. And even at this early stage, their talent was emerging.
But childhood and the freedom to roam could not last forever, and with no family fortune, all four of them would have to make their way in the world. For the girls, this would mean working as teachers or governesses, and this required further education. At the age of 15, Charlotte was sent to Roe Head School, and although homesick, she did well there, and with her studies complete, she returned as a teacher, taking Emily with her.
For Emily, though, the homesickness was too much, and after 3 months, as concerns for her health grew, she was allowed to return to Haworth while Anne took her place. The youngest Bronte sister had a far more placid nature than the wild, passionate Emily, and she accepted her life at Roe Head with Charlotte. However, Branwell, as the only boy, was allowed to chase his dream of becoming an artist. With what money could be scraped together, he set himself up as a portrait painter in Bradford. But with no training and limited talent, he failed miserably. Branwell had squandered his family's investment in him and turned to drink to drown his sorrows.
Fortunately, it was the age of steam, and as the tracks were fast cut across the Pennine landscape, Branwell found employment working for the railway. While Patrick continued to minister to the people of Haworth, all three of his daughters found positions as governesses, an experience that Anne would use for inspiration in her novel, Agnes Grey. However, Emily struggled again, and after 6 months returned to the parsonage, claiming she preferred the dogs to her pupils.
It's interesting to note that here in the church there's a monument to William Waitman, who became Patrick's curate at about this time. The handsome young man sent a Valentine's card to the sisters in 1840, and although it seems that gentle Anne was his choice, there was a tragic end to the romance. As cholera was rife in Haworth, he contracted the disease and died in 1842. The death rate in Haworth was incredibly high at the time, the reason being that these flat gravestones lying horizontally at the top of the steep hill allowed contamination from the bodies below to seep into the water supply for the whole town.
When this was discovered, the practice was stopped, but as you can see from these upright gravestones in this very crowded burial ground, for many it was too late.
For the Brontes, these were dark days. We've come to the Black Bull on Haworth's cobbled High Street, which is where Branwell Bronte could all too often be found. He'd been dismissed from the railway for constant and culpable carelessness, and again turned to drink for solace. And it wasn't just alcohol that Branwell took to excess, as he also bought opium from the apothecary across the road, as he spiralled towards addiction and even more erratic behaviour. The sisters by now realised that their brother was not just a lost cause, but also an added burden, as they struggled to improve the family finances. As time passed, though, the answer to their prayers took shape on their own doorstep, and plans for the Bronte sisters to open their own school here in Haworth took shape. Aunt Branwell offered to help finance the project, but the girls also needed to offer a varied curriculum, including modern languages. So Charlotte and Emily set off for Belgium to attend a boarding school in Brussels.
The stay was shortened as Aunt Branwell fell ill, but died before the girls reached Haworth, and the ever-homesick Emily remained to keep house for Patrick while Charlotte returned to Belgium. She was totally besotted with Monsieur Hager, the school's head, but her passion was unrequited. What's more, his wife took a very dim view of the young English girl pursuing her husband, and Charlotte's second visit was also cut short.
Even so, the girls were now equipped to open their own school, and they advertised accordingly. But they failed to attract a single pupil, leaving Charlotte to come up with an alternative strategy to generate an income.
All three of the sisters had written poetry, and although it took all Charlotte's powers of persuasion to get Emily to agree, they presented their work for publication under the male pseudonyms Currer Ellis and Acton Bell. Few copies were sold, but it was the beginning of the Brontes' literary career, and as Charlotte accompanied her father to have eye surgery, which required weeks spent in a darkened room, she started work on Jane Eyre. It was her second novel, as she'd already written The Professor, based on her experiences in Belgium, which had been turned down by various publishers, but Jane Eyre was taken immediately by Smith, Elder & Co.
Emily, meanwhile, had been working on a novel too, the wild and passionate Wuthering Heights, with Heathcliff and Cathy falling in love against the dramatic backdrop of the moors. It's believed by many that she based Wuthering Heights on Top Withens, once a solitary farmhouse that would have suited Heathcliff perfectly.
Anne had also been busy writing Agnes Grey, and along with Emily's Wuthering Heights, it was published by Thomas Newby. Despite neither story selling as well as Jane Eyre, interest was growing in the identities of Currer Acton and Ellis Bell. Then, when Newby tried to pass off Anne's dark and brooding The Tenant of Wildfell Hall as by the author of Jane Eyre, Charlotte decided that it was high time to reveal the Bronte Sisters, which was done on a visit to Smith Elder & Co. in London.
However, the success of Charlotte, Emily and Anne was of little consolation to Branwell, who spent much of his time in this very chair, in a drunken stupor. Often the Reverend Bronte was called to remove his son from the Black Bull, and eventually the young man fell victim to tuberculosis, and back at the parsonage, his days were numbered.
Branwell died on September the 24th, 1848, but the tragic consequences of this highly contagious disease were much farther reaching.
While Charlotte was still grieving for her brother, she realised that Emily and Anne were both showing the telltale symptoms of TB. Emily refused all medical help until it was too late. She died just days before Christmas at the age of 30.
As the new year progressed, Anne's condition worsened, and Charlotte took her to Scarborough in the hope that the bracing sea air would help. But it was of little use. Anne died in Scarborough and is the only member of the family not buried in the vault at Haworth.
With only Patrick and Charlotte left at Haworth, these were dark days, but eventually Charlotte turned to her writing for comfort, completing Shirley, a novel inspired by her father's Heart's-Head tales of the Luddites.
Then Charlotte returned to Memories of Belgium to write Villette, and she was by now something of a celebrity. However, there was disquiet at the parsonage between father and daughter, because Patrick Bronte's curate, Arthur Bell Nichols, proposed marriage to the now famous author. Patrick refused to give his permission, and Charlotte turned Arthur down, but eventually she agreed, and on condition that the newlyweds remained at the parsonage, the Reverend Bronte finally gave his consent, and they married in 1854. There was to be no happy ending, though. Charlotte fell ill, possibly in the early stages of pregnancy, and sadly by now you can probably guess the outcome. Patrick Bronte's last surviving child died on the 31st of March 1855, leaving him to live out his days here at Haworth with only the widowed Nichols for company.
Nevertheless, the fact that I'm standing here today, where thousands of visitors come from all over the world to find Bronte country, means that the legacy of these truly remarkable writers lives on. So it's only right that we should leave the last word to the ladies, with Emily's beautiful poem summing up the very essence of this unforgettable place.
There is a spot mid barren hills where winter howls and driving rain. But if the dreary tempest chills, there is a light that warms again. The house is old, the trees are bare, and moonless bends the misty dome. But what on earth is half so dear, so longed for, as the hearth of home?